Good afternoon and welcome back. And we're going to start the first of our two sessions where we're looking at innovation and startups and collaboration here. So I'm going to introduce, first of all, Marion Zondag from PortXL, representing the city of Rotterdam. And after that, we're going to start a panel session where I'll bring Chris and Julie and Mena Hughes up onto the panel. So I'm going to hand the floor over to you to talk about PortXL, and Chris and I will sit down and...
All right. Well, thanks, Chris. That's very important to go back and forth. This is the title, Leading Port Cities of the Future. That's basically what I'm trying to talk about, as well as the role that PortXL plays and what Rotterdam does. The quest for innovation, the Rotterdam example. This is what we're going to do. Talk a little bit, we give a little bit of introduction. Leading port cities of the future, who are those and what does it take to become a leading port city? What can we learn from Rotterdam and how can start and scale-ups contribute to this? I always like to get a little bit of engagement from the floor because I see too many people kind of using their phones to do all kind of important things. So I have a few questions for you. To start with, who of you work in private enterprise? Just to raise a hand. Okay, that's about to say 10 people. Who of you are working in government? All right, also a few investors, people in finance, bankers? Nobody. Any startups? I was interested. There's great. 6 startups. And scale-ups maybe? I did a presentation only a month ago in Genoa for 300 people, also because they wanted to make Nigeria a little bit more competitive. And I asked the same question. There were about 300 guys from government and there was no startup. So I guess we have a better mix here. Maybe I should introduce myself as well. My name is Marion Zondag. I'm director of PortXL. Background in the finance industry. I come from the hard finance investment industry. But I paid my dues and did a startup as well, working about, I guess, a year with the workout guys from the bank, trying to not get bankrupt, and in the end also spending a few years at a incubator, Yes Delft, one of the largest in the world, and I learned a lot about what it takes to become a successful startup. First of all, for the guys that don't know PortXL, we're an accelerator, first accelerator with a global maritime focus. Since 2015, since we started 4 years ago, there's about a dozen or so that have focused on the maritime sector all across the world. And really big guys have also found out that it might be an interesting area to make good money, which is, I can assure them, not easy. We have programs in Rotterdam, Antwerp, and Singapore. We accelerated about 60 companies, and what we do in the end, I guess our KPIs is whether these 60 companies have real contracts signed with companies. So those are the goals. These companies pay us. They don't pay us a lot of money, but they pay us some. And if we don't sign contracts, if there's no meaningful, concrete, tangible results, then they will actually go away, and we have to close the shop. So we have to work very hard. Accelerator business is a tough business, I assure you. So what does an accelerator do? We help young companies. I can see it here as well, it's easier. We help business partners to become innovative, which is very, very important because there's a lot of very traditional companies in the maritime space. They all think that they should become a little bit more innovative, but it's very difficult to get them really to become innovative. There's a lot of committees, steering committees, turf wars, whatever. There's a lot of budget issues, and we spend probably 50% of our time working with these corporations, and but it's very important and it's meaningful work. And we build an ecosystem. In the end, our effectiveness is very, very much dependent upon the ecosystem that we make and connections and the meaningful connections that we can actually produce. And the fourth one, we also want to change the world a little bit. Blue economy, maritime sector is very pollutive in the end, and we need to create more sustainable business in the maritime industry. Leading port cities of the future. I think it's important to know kind of the global megatrend. I'm starting to look to the, because this is only, gives me only half a screen, so it's more difficult for me to read it there than there. So, very important. The global megatrend is urbanization. 50% of the people, over 50%, live in cities, and I guess 80% of GDP is generated in cities. So we see that cities become much more important. And in the quest for the right kind of inhabitants, cities are very competitive. And to be competitive, you want to have the right people, companies, and investments, and you want to have vibrant knowledge creation and innovation. I haven't thought of this myself, but there's quite a few academics and researchers who actually spent a lot of time analyzing this. So this is important. I'll give you a few examples. Everybody knows, I guess, Boston for medtech, San Francisco for ICT, and an interesting example is also Eindhoven for deep tech. Eindhoven was a smaller city in the Netherlands. Philips Electronics used to be part of Eindhoven. They moved their head office away to Amsterdam 20 years ago. So Eindhoven was basically in panic. But in those 20 years, they kind of pulled together and created a very, very powerful ecosystem on the basis of a few companies that left. Philips Medical Systems, ASML, they make big wafers for the chips industry. And now it was actually coined most, I think, innovative mile in the world by Forbes, Wall Street Journal, and so on. So it takes a little bit of time, but you can be very competitive. And that's what port cities also have to do. So what should they do? Well, you can read it yourself. Science, higher education, you want to have owners and headquarters, R&D, psychology, what is it? Product and technology, services and startup talent. It's a mouthful, it's a lot. I'm sure that not everyone will have all of it at the same time. We're talking about Rotterdam. Rotterdam has probably a lot of this already, and it's still not easy to build it. And we had just a discussion this morning in a panel about collaborative innovation, accelerators, and so on. And people said, look, how can we get the third world countries to become much more innovative, get accelerators there? And I say, well, that's going to be a hard one, because you need a lot of elements clicking together to become successful. So, but it can be done. It can be done, but it takes time. Okay. I'll go through this very fast. Drivers of competitiveness, strategic location, stable political and efficient legal framework. That's kind of something you cannot do much about, apart from voting, I suppose, on the right person. The third, fourth, and fifth have to do with the competitive framework. Also very important, because if there's a lot of competition, people are forced to become actually innovative. You'd like to have specialized universities around. And in the end, it's always good if it's an attractive place to live for your families. That's in the quest for the right type of, I guess, inhabitants, or the right type of knowledge that you want to attract to be competitive. This is one of my favorite quotes. It's actually, everybody knows it, survival of the fittest. It's actually not said by Charles Darwin. He said something actually quite different. It was another guy who coined it, but Charles Darwin said the following: it's not the strongest species that survive, not the most intelligent, but the one who can change the fastest or the best. It's most responsive. That's important, because that's all about innovation, obviously. We have great, great challenges. And we see from research from the Port of Rotterdam that actually innovative companies show much better results. You can read it for yourself. More customers, more growth, 10% more profit in the end. So that's proven. And why does it happen? It happens because, not necessarily because they want to, because their suppliers ask for it, their customers ask for it, their authorities stimulate it. Rotterdam plays a very good role in that, for example, in our ecosystem, but I'm sure in Oslo there's also a lot of governmental agencies that work hard to become innovative or stay innovative. And you also have startup hubs and accelerators. And the third one is interesting, because it was shown that actually openness to innovation and cooperation with other companies is very important. With PortXL, we have an interesting example. One of our main sponsors is a company called Van Oort. It's a dredging company. And they were there from the start. There was a cornerstone investor, so to say. And at some point in time, we got their closest competitor also as part of PortXL. And they said, well, I'm not so sure about that. We really would not, I don't think we should do that. And we said, well, we're open innovation. So unfortunately, you have to deal with it. And now actually they kind of embrace it. Together they actually support some startups and scale-ups. So we have been able to convince them to, I guess, jump over their own shadow. And this is a very important one. So you keep that in mind if you deal with corporations who are defensive. Defensiveness will not get you into the next, I say, centennial. Maybe not even. So innovation has to do with at least half of the drivers of competitiveness for a port city or an ecosystem. I'm going to click in 2 seconds. Yeah. All right. So 2 examples I wanted to make. You have a Menon report. Maybe some of you guys know it. This is a private consultancy firm who actually rank all kinds of ports on innovation. They do it with subjective and objective kind of qualifications. And in the objective ones, Singapore and Rotterdam are the leading global maritime capitals. And it's interesting because they both had challenging environment. Singapore 60 years ago was very small, very swampy, very corrupt country, and in 60 years it has become, I guess, well, a leading port. I guess something to look up to, what they've been able to achieve. It's not necessarily democracy, so that usually helps. Rotterdam was destroyed during the war, and in the 70s was the largest port. Now we're still the 11th largest. We don't want to be the largest anymore. We want to be the most innovative. But they also did a pretty good job in just 40 years or so. So what did Singapore? We can learn from Singapore. Basically, they pour in a lot of money and a very efficient, very professional government. So they set their goals, they work towards them, they have long-term plans. So, for example, in the R&D roadmap, they make 8 innovative industries, they make 5 thrusts, they pour money in, they cooperate, the university, the MPA, Enterprise Singapore. It's a very collaborative effort, and it's successful. So, hats off to them. Rotterdam, there's other things, and we're going to talk about it as well. Strong ecosystem, lots of initiative by the Port Authority, and they're also starting to create an area where there's room for innovation, which is very important because innovation has a lot to do with gravity. You want to create a lot of networks together on a small space in the end. I go to this very fast. Innovation ecosystem of Rotterdam. It has to do with ideation. It has to do with education, probably, research, talent. Validation. That's where you want to have the business models that these ideas tend to, when these ideas tend to develop, you want to validate their business model. That's what usually incubators do, for example. Mentoring, networking is part of it. Acceleration. In the end, you want to create funding, you want to get them pilot projects, you want to make sure that they can build their stuff, so you want to have production capabilities close by, and in the end, it's growth. Then you really expect the companies to stay in your city if they want to, if they like to, and become very, I guess, large employers, because in the end, that's what makes the city successful. And this is what Rotterdam has done. I'm not going to bore you with everything what's on it, but there's about 60 initiatives all across the city. And some of it are done by the Port Authority, that's the center. Some of it are done by the port, that's the middle ring, and some of it are done by the city. You see in ideation, there's a lot of research and schooling institutions, also vocational schooling, validation. There's a number of initiatives that have to do with that, and so you can continue until finance and so on. So it's huge, and I must say it's it's maybe a little bit too much even, because there's a lot of initiatives, and it's now probably important to have them work together very well. This is another thing that I took from one of the presentations of Rotterdam Maritime Capital. This is how we try to create the educational roadmap. I really love it. It looks like a nice metro. It's all, yeah, well, we don't have such a big metro system in Rotterdam yet, but hopefully at some point in time. So I'm running out of time, so I'm moving up a little bit faster. This is the area that we have dedicated in Rotterdam to innovation. It's pretty large. In Genoa, I didn't want to emphasize it, but it's about as large as the whole port of Genoa. So, real quick, PortXL. This is what we do: energy, logistics, chemicals and refinery, as well as in the end ports. I have programs in Rotterdam, Singapore, Antwerp. And acceleration, I explained it already. What we do is increase involvement of all parties. We build ecosystems, very important. We scout a lot. Half the time of the year we're scouting, we're dealing, we're talking with companies, talking with startups. We see whether we can match technologies with, I guess, challenges of companies. It's a lot of hard work. It's not always fun. You have to deal with guys who put the phone on the horn for 5, 6 times, and then they might come to join your accelerator. We like to create meaningful connections. And in the end, we also try to build a lot of, I guess, a big network of corporate partners who in the end pay our salaries. We have a lot of initiatives all around the world. Some of it are not on there yet. Some of it have already kind of dropped off. We don't really care. In the end, we want to build this network, and everybody who wants to join can join. So concluding, let me make the concluding remarks. It's a competitive world. Cities compete for the best companies, startups, and talent. That's just a fact. So if you want to compete, you have to do a couple of things. Innovation is essential to remain competitive and helping the ecology in the end. And not only for cities, but also for companies, obviously. My son is an engineer. All the engineers in the Netherlands wanted to work for Shell 20 years ago, because that was Valhalla. And now nobody wants to work for Shell anymore. They want to work for startups. They want to work for companies that actually improve the world. And I think Shell tries to do that as well, but they have something to explain, I suppose. You want to create an ecosystem, like you've seen in Rotterdam, what we've done. With a lot of, yes, it takes a lot of trouble, but in the end you want to create a big center of gravity that's going to reinforce all these initiatives. And it takes time and a lot of focus, effort of many parties, and it should be done in a coordinated fashion. And that's probably, the last one is probably the most important one, and the most difficult one. All right, that's it. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Oh, that's it.
Can I ask the panel to come up, please? Just while they're coming up, just one of the things I wanted to ask you about PortXL is I was aware when it started a couple of years ago and you did the first program. So you go out and you scout a number of startups that you're going to bring into your accelerator program. Hi. Tell me a little bit, you stand over there behind there, but tell me a little bit about how you go about finding startups.
We talk to everybody that we know. We do research. We're on the internet. We're trying to make connections. It's really research. It's a lot of groundwork that you do.
But some of the startups I've noticed have been on other accelerator programs, or been on your accelerator program and go on to other accelerator programs.
That's what happens. That's what happens. Sometimes there's even more accelerator programs than startups, and there's guys who actually move around. And if they do it too often, then obviously that's not a good sign.
True, because they're not moving on, are they? Not growing.
Not really. And frankly, there's a number of investors who don't really want to work with startups who went to an accelerator at all anymore. Yeah. So there's inflation going on. And I hope, sincerely, that there's going to be some shakeout at some point in time, because too many guys who want to have a spot under the sun.
So here on the panel now, we've got Menno representing the Rotterdam Maritime Board, and Chris Klotz from the New York Maritime Innovation Center, where you're part of Sunny Maritime, or affiliated with that and looking at startups. And we've got a startup here from the west coast of the US who is somewhat slightly different in terms of what you were talking about. Certainly not a digital company, and I'm going to come back to you in a second. But Menno, going back to what we're hearing about the reason behind PortXL, why do you see the need from the Maritime Board's perspective? Why do you see the need for change in Rotterdam?
Yeah, we're actually a traditional port city, so we face many challenges right now. We have to renew our economy. So, for example, we are a very much fossil-based port, and now we face the energy transition. We have to move towards a non-fossil-based port. We also see that the digitalization is influencing the supply chains. So in order to remain competitive and to remain the front runner, we have to innovate. We have to innovate in the petrochemical industry, in the energy and offshore industry, and we also have to innovate in the transport and logistics chain. So that's basically the main reason that we need this type of accelerators, because they scout the world for the best startups and then they select them related to the challenges that we see for our corporates. And then they, well, Marijn told it, then they start the program and they start to help those startups to build up.
The kind of startups, tell me a little bit about the type of startups, and maybe either one of you can answer the type of startups that you would be looking for. Because are you looking for startups that would do solutions for ship operators, or are you looking for startups that would do solutions to help the port's customers?
We have changed our business model a little bit because, as I told you, we work for corporate partners in the end, which is on one hand good. It creates a little bit of limitation. But true startups for our corporate partners are usually a little bit early stage, because in the end the results take a long time, and then after 3 or 4 years somebody in the board will say, okay, it's nice, but it hasn't brought us too many tangible results. So we moved from true startups to a little bit later stage, and what we've actually done is we ask our corporate partners to create challenges and inform us what their challenges are, and then we're going to scout to find the right startups. And the most interesting ones are the startups who are not active in the maritime space. So
what kind of space?
For example, we had they do something entirely different, and they have not really considered the maritime space as their kind of beachhead market or another market. And we have to call them, and for the first 3-4 times they say, no, we're not interested. But now we have actually a few who signed contracts, and we're super grateful that we brought them in. So that's what I mentioned with a lot of hard work to make connections that are not immediately apparent.
Chris, in New York, what do you look for when you look for innovation? How do you find the innovation?
Innovation is everywhere in New York. And New York is New York. It is one of the major maritime capitals of the world. That's the plus, and that's also the minus, in that unlike Rotterdam, which is very tightly focused, New York is a financial capital. It is a logistics capital. It is a huge technology center at this point. Insurance, finance, greater logistics, intermodal, all of these pieces which constitute something connected to our industry, of course, provide sources for innovation. And that has made it it's a wonderful place, but it is also difficult because the industry is all there, and it's so big, and it's a hyper-competitive industry, as we all know. So in many cases, it's looking at specific areas of digitization that talent and the huge talent base that is in New York could be utilized from the fintech sector, from the medtech sector, and so forth to possibly get involved in maritime. We don't have those specific maritime-focused individuals who have come out of school. We have them, but not enough of them, as you would in Rotterdam. So it's taking in many cases many disparate individuals and looking at their potential ideas.
So you're very almost, I'd say, like an incubator, as much as, because what you describe as looking for companies that have gone through a certain point of development, not first stage, not very early stage. They're at the point where they need to really accelerate to become commercial. But are you kind of much earlier stage?
Much earlier stage, but also think of the firms that that are already in place, but are in need of connections.
Okay.
The financial connection, the customer connection, the greater business pieces that can be found in New York. And I think that's kind of where we see our position. These very early stage ideas, yes, because in an academic setting you have the time somewhat to devote to that. But the firms in real need are those that are maybe a year, 2 years out in terms of their development. They can't really afford to be at a North Shipping, but they do need exposure.
But you had this reverse pitch day about a year ago or something, where you got companies to say, this is our problem.
It is incredibly difficult to get companies to tell you their pain points, and many won't tell you. And so I begged people to be on our forum. And it was very rich, because once they were able to talk about that, what we would all agree is pain points don't exist for just one firm. They exist for all firms. But it's getting that dialogue in a neutral, and I keep using that term, a neutral place for that dialogue to happen. So we recently had a hackathon, and we had that about 2 months ago now. And we did something that gave us a lot of visibility, and that was we crossed wires. We had individuals from medtech, from fintech, who we provided a maritime perspective, but they brought in different points of view to look at some of these intractable problems of digitization.
And how did that work? How did you find?
So some of that was we had a producer organization that was very connected to the talent base that exists in greater New York City area. And these are developers, designers, the individuals who, and many of them come from just various fields. And we were able to get them for an intensive weekend. Because what do these people want to do? They want to solve problems, and they want to take interesting data, which we provided, and look at it. And they came from different. Their ideas came from not tried and true, but different settings. Applying AI from a fintech setting into our industry to see how it could be utilized.
Which ones do you say? Have you got some examples of what might be able to?
So we had our winner organization, which was absurdly simple idea, and yet on the face of it, but also incredibly complex, was they applied an AI program to all of the compliance pieces that a company needs as they come into a particular location. So I steam into Bangkok. And here are all the pieces, all of the documentary pieces that I'm going to need. And what they borrowed from was healthcare. Connecting the dots in our industry is so difficult. It has been. It's been the holy grail of this. And they had something that, on the face of it, looks like a very viable, possible, potential business. The trick in all of these things, of course, as we all know, is developing an idea into an actual business. Okay.
So Julie, that's a great way for me to introduce you, because Julie, you have your product developed from inside a university, basically. That's correct?
Correct.
I'll leave it for you to describe exactly what the product is, but what I was going to say is you're now at the point where you're moving out of the university and you're trying to commercialize it.
Correct.
And you've got a little bit, and I want to go into, in a minute, I want to go into the financing side a little bit, about how difficult or otherwise it is to really move on. And then I'm going to go back to talk to PortXL about that actual challenge, about the financing moving along and developing the product. But first, tell us all a little bit about Marine Construction Technologies and what it is that tell me the problem you identified and what the solution is.
The problem that Marine Construction Technologies addresses is the problem of underwater noise during pile driving. We in Seattle live in an area that is incredibly beautiful. Like here, we have a lot of very valuable fisheries and a lot of sensitive and or protected species. But we also are in a booming port that has many of the characteristics that were outlined earlier. So a lot of growth and building needs to take place. And in order to do that, most of the foundations of those structures that are near water or in water are put on top of foundation structures made of pilings, which are just big metal tubes pounded into the substrate that you can build on. Well, when you pound those pipes into the ground, it's so loud that it can actually damage or kill fish and wildlife species. So we were approached by the US government, the Federal Highway Administration, the Department of Transportation, and our state Department of Transportation to try to help them understand, one, how pile driving noise behaves, two, fix the problem, but they didn't want us to invent a new technology that would inhibit contractors from using all the equipment they had already invested in. So essentially they wanted us to make the pilings themselves quiet, and that's what our technology does. It's a very simple solution that spun out of the Department of Mechanical Engineering and our Applied Physics lab, and the way it works is essentially providing an air buffer down the entire length of the pile. It's a double-walled pile, and only the inner pipe is struck or vibrated by a hammer. So all of the vibration that driving requires is buffered by air along the length of the piling. So it ends up reducing in-water noise by 90%. So that's 20 decibels, and so we end up not affecting the fish and mammals and surrounding wildlife. The affected areas we basically live in a fjord, so all of our impact areas previously extended across the entire embayment, and now we're looking at 100 meters or so. So we have much less risk to the species, much less risk to the projects that are being constructed because they don't have to stop work when the mammals swim by or when fish are perceived in the impact area.
But at the start, you got money from government authorities to do the R&D.
Correct.
So, and that was when it was still part of the university.
Correct.
A division of the university. Now you're bringing that outside. You're commercializing it. So,
Correct.
What is your financing model now as you move to that commercial stage? Where are you going to make this a product that can sell, so that you can say, right, here we are, we're able to make it?
So I would say that we're a young enough company that we're trying to figure that out. So we had $1 million worth of grant funding that came to us really quite easily because we were part of an educational institution, part of the University of Washington. We also had some private equity, and we had founders' contributions as well. But now that we have spun out of the technology transfer program, we're hitting the pavement and trying to find funders to help us grow the company. However, of course, funders have priorities too. So some of them really don't feel comfortable doing additional pilots. Some of them really would rather see you constructing, projects in and of themselves. So our pain points are essentially, it's not a pile driving is not a hugely innovative arena. I'd say the equipment for driving piles has been quite innovative, but the piles themselves have remained metal tubes for a long time. So a transition by the industry and contractors is very slow. An adoption by end users in understanding a pretty simple piece of engineering, but something different is a little hard. And then we've had trouble too with the regulators helping us to move the product into the marketplace, not by identifying it as the only technology available, because they can't do that, but it is the only technology available that can provide 20 decibels of reduction consistently. So trying to figure out how to get through the regulatory sort of maze, as well as connecting with potential end users, and then figuring out what is the best financing model.
So that sound very familiar to a lot of the startups that you
Yeah.
have coming into accelerator programs.
Definitely. Also, as I told you, I was with Yes Delft, which is a very large university deep tech accelerator or incubator, basically. We see a lot of these solutions. They get grants, and they need grants because that takes them through the first 1 or 2 years where they do a lot of product development, prototyping, and so on. And then they hit a wall because many of these hardware kind of deep tech solutions have difficulty in scaling. And for investors, obviously, they want to make 10 times their money. In the end, with all the defaults, they end up with 3 times, which is the minimum. So unless you're able to scale quite rapidly, and in your case, I guess, with only the 20 decibels that you can achieve for the Seattle environment, you're not going to be able to scale. So you have to find other applications. You have to think with people who actually can get you in touch with other industries, find other applications. It's going to be a pretty tough job to find money. It's a good thing.
Is there money out there? Is there?
It's already
because I hear differing stories. I hear there's money being thrown around. And is the cash there?
There's a lot of money thrown around. But,
the money's out there.
It is.
No question. No question. There's a lot of money looking for value. Okay?
I've seen press release after press release over the last couple of months of startups getting huge investment amounts that.
Some. Of course, there are the big stories. Flexport in our business got a $1 billion valuation from SoftBank. Recently, a smaller firm called Nautilus Labs, which I know fairly well, received $13 million from Microsoft in terms of valuation for its product idea. So it's out there. There's a real chicken and egg piece in our industry, of course, and that is one of the toughest thing is show me what you have first. In fact, show it to me for free. And I may be interested, but first you've got to show me that this idea can do something for me. That's really hard when you're a startup, and you are, of course, are scrounging for all the revenue that you could find, and so identifying that, nursing that along. I'm going to hand it back to my colleague from the Port of Rotterdam or from PortXL.
Well,
tough choices.
Look, you see that, for example, in platforms or SaaS, people are willing to take more risks because it's a little bit of a numbers game. So they have a fair chance that they're going to have one of the winners with it if they do enough investments. And in port sector, it's a little bit more difficult, also because it's difficult to scale. Flexport has a lot of money, but within 6 years, it's in 200 countries.
Right.
It's really scaled up a lot. So there's a huge investment base in software scaling up, and there's not as much in hardware and maritime because it has.
You're not giving her optimism at the moment, are you?
No, but I think that we as investors have this. Look, let me. I think if you wanna be extremely successful as a VC, you have to go to that model. But you can also be very successful as an investor with just investing solid companies.
But one of the things you're describing, because all of these software companies, their basis is, we provide this economic benefits to our clients at the end of the day. That it's a business. What you're providing is an environmental solution that doesn't necessarily come with it that obvious cost benefit for someone to use those pylons, unless you can make those piles cheaper.
Well, you can make a pretty solid argument, but it's not on a per pile basis. The cost benefits are with project implementation. You end up saving time because you're not placing a pile, then something around it, then driving it, then removing that attenuation device and doing that around each and every piling. And time is money, so the operational and installation costs go way down. And then also the permitting. It's an incredibly arduous permitting climate, and essentially these noise levels are low enough that you can, at least in the United States, be in a sort of a lower level of permitting that is also much shorter in its duration. So you're looking at a difference from anywhere from 1.5 to 3 years to get through the Endangered Species Act process with a standard technology versus with this, once we can get the regulators to recognize the attenuation, a 3 to 6 month process, which again saves a lot of time and money.
And Menno, from your perspective, from the Maritime Board, representing a sort of a government, effectively. So you don't necessarily have the same commercial objectives that a business has, but you're still looking to how you can best improve your port environment so the economic environment is sound. How do you look at a environmental solution, a digital solution, or other solutions and say, yeah, these are going to be good, these are not going to be good? How do you say this is going to represent the temperature, the economic temperature of Rotterdam?
Yeah, we have a role as launching customer, of course. Sometimes ideas that are not market ready, but they are very important from an environmental or societal perspective. They get grants, but most of the time we urge them to find co-finance, so it becomes market ready more easily. But our main task is actually to coordinate the entire system, because we know that there are a lot of good ideas, environmentally, digital ideas. We know that there are a lot of funders, government funding, but also a lot of informal investors, angel investors, the usual banks, of course. And it's all about matchmaking, making sure that the founder can find the proper funder. And right now we do that by organizing a lot of different tailor-made meetings. Scale-ups meet corporates, scale-up meets funders, scale-up meets informal investors. Informal investors pitch what they are looking for, so the other way around. We also organize meetings with banks, for example. And we have a digital platform where people can join and sell what they want to sell, and funders can give, like Tinder, give their own profile, show what they are looking for. And so we try to make physically and digitally the connection, and that's mainly our role in the ecosystem as a government, because only by being a launching customer we can do not sufficiently, we cannot organize sufficiently the money that we want to give to the startups. And yeah, regulation is also an important thing. We can stimulate, incentivize by creating the right regulations, but that's often a process that takes like 10 years, so you cannot wait for that when you are a startup. So our main challenge is to create those platforms and those meeting places. And it's very difficult, because we often see that there is a lot of money, there's a lot of ideas, but the match is not made.
How long do you think you've got before you have to change Rotterdam?
How long we have got? Well, I think that we have like 20 years or so. But we have already been in the process of change. We already been evolving to a non-fossil port city, investing in what you told about New York, maritime business services, for example, new technology firms. Those are the new port companies of the future. It's not only about the big trade and the big cargo flows. It's more about technology, new products, and also maritime industries. So we're in the midst of the change, and it's a gradual process, but we will follow the same time period as, for example, the Paris Agreement has pointed out, and we have to be in front of the rest.
And you're using PortXL, obviously, to help sort of literally accelerate your own process and bring them in.
Yeah.
How many of these accelerator programs has PortXL held now? Is it 4?
We have now 4. We have one in Antwerp, we have one in Singapore, and we have now started in Taranto, in the southern part of Italy, and they're all a little bit different. And we, as a true startup, we're now kind of becoming a scale-up. We validate ideas and see what works and what doesn't.
And the startups come in, and they'll have how long is the acceleration program that an individual startup will have once you accept it?
It's usually about 3 months.
3 months.
3-month program. It's very intensive. And as I told you, we have now startups, but also scale-ups. Scale-ups have a little bit less intensive program because they immediately start working on a actual pilot with a corporation.
Okay, so you'll have found a kind of partner with them to help
Well,
them.
they be matched because our partners actually, they will select them. They will put out a challenge. We scout them, and then they select, and they only come when there's a selection made, when they're chosen.
What made you go to Antwerp and Singapore and Toronto? Surely you're helping his competitors.
We don't look at it in that way, honestly, because as I told you, open innovation is all about transparency and sharing. And I guess if Rotterdam is very scared of Taranto, which is in the southern part of Italy, it would be strange, nor they're very scared about Singapore, because that's a different part of the world. There's good competition, I suppose, trying to become the most innovative port in the end, but that's fine. For us, it's important to build an ecosystem, as I explained to you, because in the end, gravity, a lot of meaningful connections create network effects. In that case, we're not dissimilar to Google or Facebook or whatever. We want to create as many connections as possible. And if we can do that by having another program in Antwerp, fine. Took also a little bit of convincing the Port Authority in Rotterdam to say, what are you going to do in Antwerp? Because that's maybe a little bit too close for comfort. But in the end, this is how the world works. And we are independent from the Port Authority. We're an independent organization in the end. So.
I realise you're an independent organisation, which is why I was wondering about the sort of the growth into the new port as well. Are you going to go to New York?
Yes, if Chris is inviting us.
Absolutely, yes. And taking the words out of my mouth, building a maritime ecosystem is really it's really a ground up. We are just beginning in that. Right. So I would say that you already provide expertise and background that could be utilized.
We made a lot of mistakes. We want you not to make them. So don't worry about it.
Well, this is also it's a hot space. Maritech is a hot space right now. It's the reason I'm here. It's the reason why so many people are here. Because there's potential for some real groundbreaking innovations in this time period. I would say, the question you asked earlier, I would say that things are going to be very transformative within this 5-year period of time. Even shorter than that. I think there's just a tremendous amount of interest in this aspect right now.
I've got our final Blue Talk today is going to look more at these ecosystems, at the collaborative networks, and how companies are benefiting from actually having that sort of environment. You come from the Maritime Alliance, and I know Michael's going to be on this final panel here, but how good do you find having a sort of network? Because you're a unique kind of company. The other members of the Maritime Alliance are completely different to you. They don't have that kind of focus on that solution. You said the university got given a solution to solve, a problem to solve, sorry, and you went away and you solved it, and now you're looking to how you can commercialize it. So where do you find the common ground with other startups?
Well, I think it's the lessons learned. Even though we might be I might be promoting and trying to commercialize a particular technology. I think a lot of the lessons in business, a lot of the lessons in growing an ecosystem, and honestly, a shared ecosystem in the maritime space has been incredibly valuable. Also, the networking that has come through the Maritime Alliance and the whole notion of a very active cluster has been incredible, not just in the United States, but internationally. So I think it just creates a synergy, honestly. It's a micro ecosystem, but it's a really functional and effective ecosystem for a company of our size because we can lean on each other, learn from each other, and then help each other network and get out into the world. So it's been invaluable.
Does anybody else have any comments or thoughts? Any of the startups have got any experiences they want to share? I have got a microphone.
Speak out loud. I think, just talk about marine technologies. You're talking about your investment. I think you're a perfect candidate for impact investing. And you could possibly get quickly signed up because impact investing would look out for more candidates. They would have more funds than actual projects coming in. Oh, you have to talk to him.
Any comment?
I agree. Maybe we can talk.
He's not an impact investor.
No, that's fine.
Anybody else got any thoughts? There's one right at the back there.
Hi. Does it help if you get funding from different groups like the EU or from a national delegation to help a startup towards VC capital?
Sure, sure. And that's usually absolutely necessary because VC will not step in if it's too early stage. So you need, particularly for hardware solutions, which usually take a lot more time, prototyping and so on, you need a lot more time and you need money, and that's usually the government through grants that is going to provide it, or maybe co-investment schemes by the government. And then, as VCs come in, when Julie has, at some point in time they usually take the technology as a starting point, and we have to usually the Accelerate, we have to kind of turn it around and say, look, now you got to take the problem as or the consumer or the one who's going to use it as your starting point, and go back and try to find cash, and then VCs will probably become more interested.
Yeah, but normally you show the government that there is interest before they even give any funding. So there is actually a potential market connected to your funding that should make it easier for.
Well, the government doesn't really throw money at projects that do not have some traction, but they don't necessarily need to make a return. There's a social return, obviously, to create an environment where innovation is stimulated. So, I hope that was an answer to your question.
Thank you. Anybody else got any final thoughts here? No, they don't. Julie, Chris, Menno, Marin, thank you very much. Could we say thank you to our panel?
Thank you.